We tend to think of globalization as a pretty modern thing, right? Like a straight line of progress, just connecting our world more and more. But what if I told you the real story is way more complicated? That the history of our interconnected world is actually a cycle. The data tells this wild story, and it's shaped like a giant letter U.
So let me start with a question that might just blow your mind. Was the world actually more globalized over 100 years ago than it is today? I know, it sounds kind of crazy, but the answer is pretty surprising.
Because the thing is, in a lot of really crucial ways, the answer is yes. The era just before World War I was so incredibly interconnected, historians have a special name for it: the First Global Century.
So what exactly was this first global century? Well, it all boiled down to three massive, world-changing flows that were connecting continents in ways nobody had ever seen before.
This whole thing basically stood on three giant pillars. First, you had a massive boom in goods being traded all over the place. Second, a truly staggering movement of people across borders. And third, a colossal flow of money, of capital, for investments. These were the three things that built this new connected world.
So how did this global explosion even happen? What was the spark? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was more like a perfect storm, a powerful mix of technology, politics, and economics all coming together at exactly the right moment.
And you can see how it all combined right here. It really kicked off with a big policy change in 1846, when Britain, the economic superpower of the day, went all in on free trade. Then you add in a technology revolution, steamships and railroads that just completely shrank the globe. This was all fueled by the Industrial Revolution, of course, which created this insane demand for raw materials and new markets. And the glue holding it all together? 100 years of relative peace, the Pax Britannica, which made doing business globally safer than it had ever been.
And if you want to see just how big a deal that transportation revolution was, just look at this number: 55%. That's how much the cost to ship something across the Atlantic dropped in just 2 decades. I mean, the entire barrier of distance was just being torn down.
The movement of people was just as stunning. Over 50 million Europeans packed their bags for a new life overseas, mostly in the Americas. To put that into perspective, right before World War I, about 15% of the people in the US and Canada were foreign-born. We didn't see that level again until our own century.
And then there was the money. Oh, the money. At its absolute peak, Britain was investing a staggering 40% of its entire national savings in other countries. This was the cash that built the railways, the ports, and all the infrastructure that made this new global economy actually work.
But here's the thing. This amazing, hyper-connected world, it was actually really fragile. And after decades of this integration, the global economy didn't just slow down, it shattered. And this is where we start heading down the steep side of that U-shape. Suddenly, the whole world just slammed on the brakes and turned inward. World trade, as a piece of the global economy, absolutely plummeted. Borders that had been open for generations slammed shut to migrants. Remember that 15% foreign-born population in North America? By the 1960s, it was down to just 6%. The Great Retreat was in full swing.
And this collapse wasn't some slow, gentle decline. Nope. World War I brought that first global century to a sudden and dramatic end. First the war, then the Great Depression, and then a massive political backlash against open borders. They systematically dismantled the very world they had spent a century building.
Now, this first global century had clear winners and losers. Some nations industrialized and got super wealthy, while others got left behind or even saw their own local industries get wiped out. This brings up a huge question. How did the winners pull it off? Well, it turns out they were all running a surprisingly similar playbook.
This strategy even has a name: the Standard Model of Economic Development. It was basically a national game plan, a 4-part strategy to build up your own industrial power, so you wouldn't just get swamped by all the cheap stuff coming out of Britain.
So the playbook had 4 key moves. First, unify your country into one big domestic market. Second, protect your new infant industries with tariffs. Third, set up development banks to pump money into industrial projects. And the 4th step, which turned out to be the absolute game changer, was to educate your people, all of them.
Okay, but this leads to a really fascinating puzzle. If the strategy was so clear, why did it create industrial powerhouses in some places but lead to limited growth or even decline in others?
This table tells the whole story. Look at the US and Germany. They did all 4 steps, especially mass education, and they successfully industrialized. Now look at Mexico. They only did parts of the playbook, and crucially, they neglected to educate the masses. The result? Limited growth. And in colonial India, where Britain was calling the shots, there were no protective tariffs, no development banks, and almost no public schools. India actually de-industrialized. The lesson is crystal clear. To win the game, you had to run the entire playbook.
So this split, this divergence, it created a totally new world order. Let's take a look at the massive shift in global economic power that happened, and then the slow, decades-long climb back up the other side of the U.
So before the Industrial Revolution, let's say around 1750, this is what the world looked like. China and India were the manufacturing powerhouses, together producing nearly 60% of the world's goods. The West was just a tiny slice of the pie. Now, fast forward 200 years to the 1950s. The world has been completely turned upside down. North America alone is now producing half of all manufactured goods. And China and India? Their combined share has collapsed from almost 60% to just 4%. This is what economists call the Great Divergence.
After World War II, the developed world started the slow process of rebuilding. Guided by new institutions and a new commitment to lowering tariffs, those connections that had been broken for decades started to reform. This is the beginning of the upward curve of our U.
And the results were pretty dramatic. From that low of just 5.5% in 1950, world trade tripled as a share of the global economy by the end of the century. It actually surpassed the levels from way back in 1913. And there you have it, the U-shape of globalization was complete.
But here's a really crucial part of the story. This reglobalization wasn't universal, not at first. For many newly independent nations, like China and India, globalization looked a lot like the colonial system they'd just escaped, so they actually rejected it, turning inward for decades before finally rejoining the global economy late in the 20th century. And that pivot, well, it set the stage for the world we live in today.
So we've seen it all. Globalization's dramatic rise, its sudden collapse, and its remarkable rebirth. This U-shaped history is a powerful reminder that all this interconnectedness, it's not a one-way street. It's not guaranteed. Which leaves us with a final really urgent question. Where does the curve go from here?